thanks to everybody for joining this this Zoom session. I'm Mark Van Dyke. I'm the Associate Dean of Research in the College of Engineering. And the way this all came about is I had some discussions with Art Dmitro about CDMRP. Those sort of spilled over and had some discussions with Jennifer Barton about CDMRP. That was prompted by the fact that the CDMRP, Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, pre-announcements have been coming out over the last couple of weeks. And if you're not familiar with this program, they typically will start with pre-announcements that say, hey, the full announcement for this program or that program is going to be coming out pretty soon. So seeing that kind of activity, I thought it would be a good time to talk about CDMRP and strategies for getting funding from this very large program, especially for folks in the medical space. Although if you're not in BME or in the College of Medicine, then there's still a lot of relevance here for you, because there's actually a lot of technology areas where folks from across the university, and especially in engineering where I sit, can respond to these things. So I want to just kind of give a little bit of background and talk about some strategies that have been successful for me. I've been submitting proposals to CDMRP for about 10 years, and I've had over $8 million of funding. I can't remember how many projects, 7, 8, 9, 10 projects I think have been funded between myself and collaborators. And I've done a lot of reviewing for this program as well, which is incredibly helpful. So if you haven't reviewed for this program and only submitted proposals, it can be a little vexing. And I understand from Jennifer and Art that that several people in BME and some folks in the College of Medicine as well, Bio 5 affiliates particularly, have been frustrated by getting invited for a full proposal after submitting a pre-proposal and then not getting funded. And so to the degree to which I could be helpful, I want to be able to do that and share some of the insights. So I'm gonna, I got a short slide deck here, and what I want to do is leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So I'm going to keep track of the time here and make sure that we have a good 15 or 20 minutes at the end. Any quick questions before we start, or are my slides okay? Everybody can see and hear me okay? All right, hearing no problems, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So for those of you, I'm assuming that not everybody is intimately familiar with CDMRP, so I have just a couple slides on some background. This is really relevant because the way in which this program got stood up really affects how proposals are reviewed and what gets funded, and even how programs are managed. And in a certain way, CDMRP is almost kind of like the anti-NIH. So if you've done a lot of NIH grants and have a lot of NIH funding, I could see where it would be frustrating, because a lot of the sentiment and character of this program really kind of carries with it almost an anti-NIH and more of a DoD perspective. The program was started in 1992. And basically, there was a grassroots campaign, largely in the cancer patient, cancer survivor community, where they went to Congress and they wanted Congress to provide more funding, but they wanted to do it. They wanted Congress to do it in a way that was different than the National Institutes of Health and the NCI. So they lobbied Congress not only for the money, but also for an approach that was more applied and more translational. And didn't necessarily put the emphasis on creation of new knowledge and understanding of underlying disease etiology, but was really more focused on developing solutions that could be of more near-term benefit to patients. So the program, as I said, started in '92, and it started in breast cancer in particular, and quickly added a prostate cancer focus. And initially designed to be very different than the NIH programs, as I've described. And so Congress intentionally took this money and intentionally created this office and put it in this office. And this office has always been associated with the Department of Defense, because the people who are lobbying for this and the congressional folks who put it together recognized that DoD types of programs were more applied or more milestone driven. It wasn't quite the DARPA model, if you're familiar with that, but sort of in between NIH and DARPA, where it was definitely milestone driven projects. It was definitely translational. And the emphasis was on the investigators to really move the needle in these areas and provide near-term benefit to patients and caregivers and their family. They were looking for solutions. And so not only the office itself and how the office gets run, but the review process in particular reflects many of these unique aspects of the program. And maybe that's the source of frustration with some people in not being able to get these things funded. If you don't understand the history and understand why this program is different than NIH and understand how that's reflected in the review process, then it can be challenging to write a proposal that makes it through the peer review process and actually gets recommended for funding. So just some other background, this program, CDMRP office, has grown. It was just a few people, a handful of people in '92, and now it's dozens and dozens of people. And they've added all different sorts of mechanisms, funding mechanisms and programs and disease areas. I'll show you some of those in subsequent slides. But there's basically 4 different program areas that CDMRP manages, because as it's been successful, Congress has given them more and more money. So DoD has tacked on things and asked the CDMRP to manage things for them. So basically CDMRP grew and built a peer review, or I say a multi-tiered, multi-layered review process, a program management capability, money management capability. And as that capability grew, they got more and more programs and really expanded. So now they have 4 different program areas. There are the disease-based program areas that are their tradition and how they started, things like cancer. Then they also added a number of military-based programs because the DoD wanted to take advantage of all the infrastructure that they built and the good job that they were doing. So they added things like joint warfighter, military burn, and some of the peer-reviewed medical research programs. That's a second bucket of program areas. Then there's the medical practice or specialty-based research areas. These are things like the peer-reviewed orthopedic research program and the spinal cord injury program. And then the 4th are just programs that are supported by CDMRP. They may not be the main driver, but the sponsor or the agency or sub-agency that actually sits over top of that program turns to CDMRP to take advantage of a lot of their infrastructure, like they may run the review process, for example. So a good example of that is the Armed Forces Institute for Regenerative Medicine, which I was a part of the phase 1 of that when I was at Wake Forest. And then various SBIR and TTR programs, CDMRP office helps out a lot with that. So in the disease research space, many of you who have seen these program announcements have seen these, what I call laundry lists of disease areas. And this is also, I think, added to the complexity and maybe the frustration of investigators, because as CDMRP has been successful with things like breast cancer, they added all different kinds of cancer. And then they've moved beyond cancer to all these other disease areas. And basically the way that these are getting added is these advocacy groups are going to Congress and saying, I want more work being done in epilepsy or in melanoma or lupus. And the congressional folks have said, yeah, we've got this great program, this office, CDMRP. And so we're going to add money and a topic and have CDMRP run it. And so that's where we've gotten to this, these kinds of program announcements where, you know, it's called the peer-reviewed medical research program, for example, but your proposal has to be focused on or has to address one of these disease areas. That's great for the work being done in these disease areas, because I think my own opinion is that CDMRP runs these programs really well and they are making really strong progress, but it kind of dilutes the effort. If there's not significant money being put behind all of these requests, then the work that can get done is actually a little bit diluted. And CDMRP recognizes that they've got this problem now. They're almost a victim of their own success. And so you as an investigator, you look at this and you say, oh my gosh, look at all of these different areas that people can propose in, there's just going to be a ton of competition. And that's true. This will draw in a lot of proposals, and it dilutes the funding, and it makes it difficult to get an award. But I think with some maybe some insider tips, it's perhaps a little less daunting. Another feature of the CDMRP programs and the CDMRP office is, in addition to all those program areas, they also have these different award mechanisms. And these are meant to kind of mirror or focus money and focus investigators into types of research that accomplish what CDMRP wants them to accomplish. So for example, the Discovery Award is a lower dollar, shorter period of performance that really tries to focus on new discoveries. So this is very little preliminary data. This is funding ideas and seeding ideas at a fairly small level. Maybe kind of like an R21 or maybe an R15 kind of concept, if you're familiar with the NIH system. The investigator-initiated award would be more like an NIH R01. So this is where you get more money, you have a longer period of performance, more important contribution is expected for that longer time and more money. And so this one is going to be directed to things that are obviously beyond feasibility, where the feasibility of proof of concept work has already been done. You've put that in your proposal, maybe you've published some of it, and that's what's going to make you competitive, because this is much further down the road. And then a couple of other ones, the Technology or Therapeutic Development Award and the Focus Program Award are their big awards, and there are some that are even larger than this. Clinical Trial Awards, for example, can go to $10 million. And as you can imagine, the maturity of the research and the technology development is getting higher and higher with these higher dollar amounts and longer periods of performance. So the expectation of the amount of work that's already been done is going to be higher and higher. For a Technology Development Award, for example, it definitely has to be focused on the translational aspects of the technology, prevention, detection, diagnosis, or treatment. But the technology or the research has to be pretty far along in order to be competitive for one of these types of award. And then the Focus Program Award is kind of like an NIH program project. So you can see them kind of mirroring some of the structure of the NIH in terms of these different award mechanisms, which is really smart of them to do that. People are used to it, but it also kind of focuses the efforts of the investigator and causes them to kind of build the project in a specific way that the CDMRP wants to see, because that's the way that they want the project run. Again, the downside is that the more award mechanisms and the more program areas, unless Congress comes in and just fills that with a bunch of money, then the amount of money gets diluted across multiple award mechanisms and multiple disease areas, let's say, even within the same FOIA request. And so it can lead to a fairly low level of successful awards. But again, if you know what you're doing, you can kind of increase the odds that you will be successful. So just briefly, I want to talk about the application process, then I'll talk about the review process. So if you're not familiar with this, I really like this personally, because it uses, typically, this is not always the case, but typically it uses a pre-proposal mechanism. The reason I like it is because it's a minimal investment, right? It's only a 2 or 3 page pre-proposal. They're fairly easy to put together. You don't have to do a formal budget, so you don't have to go through all of that stuff and figure out exactly where every penny's going to go. And it's basically putting your idea in front of a program manager, because they're reviewed in-house. They're reviewed in the CDMRP office by a program manager. And so you're basically able to pitch directly, in a way, directly to the program manager, your idea with minimal effort. Those then are down selected, and full proposals are invited from that pool of pre-proposals. So for many of these programs, you have to submit a pre-proposal. It's not the same as a letter of intent. You have to submit it. It is required to get to the full proposal level. And they'll do that turnaround. They'll do those reviews and do the invitations typically within 1 to 2 months. If they like your idea, then they will ask you, you'll get an invitation letter, and you'll get an invitation to submit a full proposal. The tough thing about this program, and one of the things that investigators need to keep in mind, is this timeline that I'm trying to lay out for you. You submit your pre-proposal, it's reviewed within 1 to 2 months, you get your notice of whether you're invited, and that invitation to submit your full proposal, the deadline for that full proposal can be as little as 6 weeks. So you really have to go into this knowing this timeline and understanding that if you get invited for a full proposal, that you're going to have a pretty short time frame in which to get all of that together. And there's a big jump between pre-proposal and full. Your pre-proposal is usually just a couple pages, and then your full proposal, the technical writing portion could be as much as 20 or 25 pages, or as little as 8 to 10. So that can be a fairly significant effort depending on the award mechanism. And so 6 weeks goes by pretty fast. And then once that full proposal is submitted, the funding decision can be 6 months or more. Another thing that makes CDMRP unique, and I don't know that everybody, I don't know that this is common knowledge, but it's written about, it's in their FOIAs. There's actually 4 levels of review. The first being that pre-proposal. At the pre-proposal stage, the numbers show that about half the pre-proposals are selected for full proposal. So it's not an incredibly robust screen, but about half the ideas will get rejection letters, and they won't move on to full proposal. Once you're invited for full proposal, there's a peer review step in the process, there's a programmatic review, and then there's a military relevance review. And so your proposal has to go through all 3 of these. The one that we hear the most about is the peer review. It's only, as I said, it's only done on full proposals, and it's a highly diverse panel of experts that actually does this peer review process. After the peer review process, which I'll go into more detail on the next slide, then it goes to programmatic review. And you might argue that this is kind of like the NIH, but it's really not. And that's because the program managers at the CDMRP have much more discretion of what they fund than do the NIH. And so they really can look hard at things like the fit within their program. And this is where it gets a little tricky. If they've already funded 3 proposals on lupus in a prior year or a couple prior cycles, and you're coming in with the 4th or 5th or 6th really well scored lupus proposal, it could be the best scored proposal in that particular cohort, but at the programmatic review level, it doesn't get selected for funding because they've already got too many funded projects in that space. So these program managers have tremendous discretion to basically not fund really well reviewed proposals that got a really good score in the prior peer review. And then the military relevance review is basically just a rubber stamp. It's usually a 2-star general who looks at these things and says, okay, yeah, I trust the peer review and the programmatic review, so I'm going to go with the recommendations of the folks at the program level, and I'm going to approve for funding whatever they recommend. So it's usually just a rubber stamp step in the process, but it does have to go through that step as well. So this is where kind of the rubber meets the road, and this is the part that you have to really understand, I think, to be successful with CDMRP proposals. The peer review process is really important, but the program level review is important as well. So I want to go through this step first. The peer review panel and CDMRP prides itself on doing things differently than the NIH. Just like NIH, you're going to have subject matter experts. There's usually 3 or 4 of these folks, depending on the size of the proposal. Bigger proposals will have more like 4, and then the typical RO1s will have maybe 3. They're pulled usually from cohorts of investigators who've previously been funded by CDMRP. That's how I landed on so many CDMRP panels. Is once I started getting funded, I started getting asked to serve on a bunch of panels. So they'll find people wherever they can find it, but they pull from their own database of people that they've funded or people who are highly published in the area. So they will be good, solid subject matter experts. And in some ways, maybe better matched to that particular proposal mechanism than the NIH does. Very often, especially if it's a very translational kind of project, there will be a practicing clinician on the panel. That's not always the case in an NIH panel. It can be a lot of PhD scientists, but they're almost always going to have a clinical perspective on these proposals. And so you, as a PhD investigator, if you don't have that insight, you need to be talking to clinicians about your proposal, because a clinician probably will be reviewing your proposal on a CDMRP review panel. Two other really interesting, or maybe three other really interesting things that CDMRP does is they do a consumer reviewer, a tech transfer reviewer, if the project is one of the larger ones and involves an expectation of technology transfer. And then there are other specialist reviewers. So for example, a clinical trial proposal would have a biostatistician, maybe a human subjects expert. But I want to drill down a little bit on the consumer reviewer and the tech transfer reviewer, because these are really important. And this is sometimes an area where proposers kind of miss the mark. So the consumer reviewer is actually a potential user of technology or the medical product. So they have personal experience typically with products that are already on the market, whatever the standard of care solution may be. They may have personally experienced it themselves. So they have tremendous insight into the technology or the approach that you are proposing. They may not be a scientist. They're a user. They're a practitioner. There's somebody there that's going to be involved with the use or application of similar kinds of products or services, or would be a future user of the technology that you're proposing. And very often they're a patient. And they focus on the impact that your research could have. And they are very, very strongly briefed to go into the review process with that mindset. They're not being asked typically to review the science. They're being asked the question, if this is successful, if this investigator can do everything that they've said, you have to assume they can do everything that they have said they're going to do in this proposal. If they can achieve all that, what will the impact to you as a consumer reviewer be? And that's the insight that they offer. It's very powerful. I'll talk a little bit more about it on the next slide. The technology transfer reviewer, so if it is one of these more translational projects, you're going to be asked as the investigator, you've got to put a section specifically addressing translation in your proposal. And sometimes this can be as little as a page, sometimes as much as 10 pages. And so this is another significant part of the proposal where CDMRP will bring in a very qualified subject matter expert. It's usually a university tech transfer professional or someone with tremendous experience in doing things like taking university generated IP and turning it into a startup company. So a CEO or a CSO of a startup company. So they've got tremendous expertise as well. And their opinion matters immensely. So just to drill down on that a little bit more, the influence of the consumer and the tech transfer reviewer cannot be overstated. I've been on many, many, many panels, and these folks get listened to very, very carefully. As I said, they're typically a patient or a caregiver. So if I'm the scientific reviewer, I'm listening to these folks just because their story and their background and their perspective is so compelling to me. I've been on several spinal cord injury review panels of late in the last couple of years. And so these are paraplegic, quadriplegic patients who've been in the healthcare system trying to deal with all of the hardships and impact to their lives as a person who's had a spinal cord injury. And so their perspective is incredibly compelling. The thing that I've noticed too is over the years, because I've been doing this for about a decade, is that these consumer reviewers are getting better and better and better. 10 years ago, when these were first introduced and we had these folks on our panels, they were very quiet and they didn't say a whole lot because maybe they were a little bit intimidated by the level of science that was being discussed there and everybody around them is a PhD or a clinician. But what CDMRP very smartly has done is they have developed a strong network, and these consumer reviewers are very, very almost emotionally attached to these programs. They're typically patients or advocates, and they've gotten connected to CDMRP, and they're serving on these panels year after year after year. And as they serve on multiple years, they get more and more comfortable with the science and technology. And so their expertise as a consumer reviewer is getting better and better and better. And I would say now, after 10 years of doing this, the folks that I see as the consumer reviewer on these panels are outstanding. And there are people who've been doing it for 3, 4, 5, 6 or more years. And so they're almost listened to more and more because they've gotten better and better at doing this. Similarly, but not to the same degree, the tech transfer folks, CDMRP has built a network of these people. They come back year after year to serve on these panels. And the technology development piece of it has become so important because it gets very complicated with things like tech transfer, regulatory requirements, if it's a clinical study, for example, or uses human subjects. And then intellectual property can get very tricky. And these folks understand this, and they need to help the panel understand it and the program managers understand it. So those last bullet points are kind of specific to the tech transfer reviewer. What I've seen in reviews is that many times an investigator will submit what I would consider a very superficial translation plan, meaning there's sort of a standard script that a lot of people follow, saying, I'm going to do all this really cool research, and I'm going to discover things, and I'm going to invent things. And when I invent things, here's my tech transfer piece. I'm going to submit my invention disclosure. It's going to get turned into a patent application, and then my tech transfer people are going to license it. And if they can't find a big company to license it to, then we'll start a company. That's kind of a generic script that people put in the tech transfer section. Those types of generic or superficial translational plans are not getting reviewed well anymore. They've been proffered for years, and tech transfer people are ripping them apart because they know from experience that that type of approach typically does not result in a product that the patient can actually benefit from, that a clinician can actually use. Those types of plans are where intellectual property goes to die. And that's kind of been the historical result. And so tech transfer people and even subject matter experts who've seen these types of proposals and have been on CDMRP panels for years and years and years know that that kind of build it and they will come strategy really does not work. And it almost never results in a product that hits the market with an FDA approval that the clinician can buy and the patient can benefit from. So the tech transfer piece of this is really important. So the way that the review process works is that we all work virtually even before the pandemic and do our initial scores. Everybody can see the initial scoring. And so when you meet as a group, either virtually or in person, and these are all done in person before and probably will be again after the pandemic. So you have all that dynamic exchange and you get to meet and talk to the consumer advocates and the tech transfer people. You have your meals together and you get to know them really well. It's actually a really cool experience. If you haven't been on a CDMRP panel, I highly recommend it for a whole variety of reasons. But the important point that I want to make on this slide is, again, unlike NIH, the scientific review officer and the chair of the review panel have a lot of discretion, and they've been told to exercise that discretion. They have been told, they have been trained to kind of push reviewers, and that's very unlike NIH. If you have someone on the study section who says, I hate this proposal, I want to trash it, I'm going to give it an absolutely awful score because I don't ever want to see this thing again. You can do that as an NIH reviewer. You can try to do it as a CDMRP reviewer, but I've never seen it done successfully. When people come to the review panel with that kind of attitude and that sort of approach, they generally get coached by the chair, by the SRO to kind of take the rough edges off their review. Be more constructive. Give the investigator actionable advice and guidance so that they can revise and resubmit. It's not just a more genteel way of doing peer review. They actually want to provide value to the people who are not funding and give them constructive advice. It's not constructive to just say, you're a terrible scientist, your idea sucks, go away and never return. that doesn't help anybody. And so a really important part of the review process is that you can expect you will get constructive criticism back, because the SRO and the chair, at least in my experience, really pushes the review panelists to approach it that way. So successful strategies, how can you kind of think about this and approach this and what may work for you? I think one of the most important things that you can do for yourself is deeply know and understand the problem, okay? You've got to go beyond your own research, beyond your own laboratory, beyond your own understanding, which may be highly, highly scientific and very, very specific. You've got to understand the broader picture. Where can you get that broader picture? You can do things like look at the information that's put forth by disease society and patient advocacy groups. They're all over the internet. I would even reach out to them and talk to these folks. They'd be happy to talk to you. There's special meetings that you can go to, maybe not the typical meetings that you would attend as an investigator. And then something I'm going to talk more about, what's called customer discovery. And if you're familiar with the Innovation Core program or Lean Launchpad methodology, then you'll know what I'm talking about. You've got to do your own homework and do your own intelligence. You've got to choose the right program. If your research is too early stage, then you may have to go to one of the discovery kinds of programs. If you have good feasibility data, and I would say real world feasibility, not theoretical feasibility, then you could go to more of a translational mechanism. It's tempting to go after more time and more money, but if it's not a good fit for where you are, you won't get reviewed well. You've got to speak to all of the different reviewers. You can't afford to just write to the technical people. You've got to write to the technical people, to the tech transfer people, to the consumer advocate. If you're not addressing all of the stakeholder perspectives and you're focusing only on the science, for example, you might get great scores from the scientific reviewers, but then the tech transfer person, the consumer reviewer, they may not think that much of your proposal. And as they're talking at the review panel, then some of the scientific people might bring their scores down too in light of what these people think about your proposal. So you can't forget about them as stakeholders in this process. And then you can't oversell your project. This is very translational. It's very focused on fixing the problem. And if your fix of the problem is too abstract, or you're too optimistic about your chances of being able to solve the world's problems with your little individual proposal, it's going to come across in the way that it gets read and reviewed. And folks will know that you're trying to kind of oversell. So understanding kind of where your approach or where your technology sits in the world is really important, like being able to acknowledge and discuss competitive approaches, standard of care. You really have to be knowledgeable about those things, and you have to discuss them in your proposal and maybe educate or at least enlighten and inform the reviewer about why your stuff is different. You can't just say you're the best and then never say anything about anybody else, because there's going to be someone on the review panel, a clinician, who says, hey, we've already solved this problem. What we have already works. Why would we fund this proposal? I've seen lots of proposals go down the flame just because of a statement like that. So how do you deeply know and understand the problem? This is work for you. This is your homework, more than just writing the proposal, writing a good proposal that reads well. You've got to deeply know and understand the problem, and that's got to come through in the proposal. So I mentioned before, these disease societies and patient advocacy groups, you need to look at the information that's on the internet, and you need to reach out to these folks. They will help you. They love to hear from scientists who want to do research on this stuff. So for example, that big long list of different disease areas that I showed at the beginning, you can probably find a patient advocacy group for every single one of those diseases. And chances are they've got a website and they've got contact information. You can find that and send them an email and say, I'm putting together a proposal to do research in this area. I would love for you to connect me with some patients that I can talk to and better understand what they deal with and how my research might be applicable to improving their prognosis or their quality of life. Similarly, you need to talk to clinicians. If you're not a clinician and you're not connected to some, you need to establish those connections. And you can do it right here in Tucson. You could reach out to our colleagues at the College of Medicine. Very often there might be a center or a research institute that's dedicated to that particular area of clinical practice. I use it as an example, the Comprehensive Pain and Addiction Center, or CPAC. There's folks there that would love to talk to you about your research program, maybe even be a collaborator on the proposal. Going to specialty meetings is particularly helpful as well. One that I recommend, it used to be called ATAC, Advanced Technology Applications for Combat Casualty Care. Now it's called the Military Health System Research Symposium, MHRS. And of course, this is virtual for this year. It was virtual last year, but it'll get back to in-person meetings. I went to ATAC probably 5 or 6 times in a row before I got my first award from CDMRP. These are military health, so they help primarily with things like orthopedic research, orthopedic trauma, peer-reviewed medical research program, things that have a military battlefield or a VA kind of component to them. But really learning and understanding what the military system deals with from a healthcare perspective, it's different, and it takes an effort to learn what that is and what the problems are and how people deal with them. So going to a symposium like this can really be helpful in that regard. You'll learn a ton if you've never really, if you don't know a lot about the clinical practice in this space. And then my last soapbox I'm going to jump on is customer discovery. And I would almost, I'm using the word customer discovery because that's the jargon that's used in this world of lean launchpad methodology, I-Core, if you're familiar with those sorts of things. But it's really stakeholder discovery. You need to understand what these stakeholders know that you don't know. What's the patient perspective? What's the tech transfer perspective? If you're doing something highly translational, it's going to go into a clinical study. What's the regulatory perspective? What are the IRB considerations? What are the clinical practice considerations? Those people are all stakeholders in what you need to do in getting from where you are in the laboratory today to where you need to be 3 years from now with this type of funding. So what I would recommend that you do, if you don't know about customer discovery and lean launchpad methodology, is do this online training. It's called How to Build a Startup. It's available through a company called Udacity that has all kinds of online training. I've got a link to it here, and I'm going to give my slides to Amy, and she can disseminate them to all the Bio 5 folks. I'll probably send them out to the engineering faculty as well. So you can get to this, use this hyperlink and register for that training. It's all online, it's short little videos, and it'll talk about and give you the basic nuts and bolts of lean launchpad methodology and something called the business model canvas. And if you learn that, and you're fully capable of learning, it's just a couple hours of video, and I strongly recommend it. It will change, I guarantee you, it'll change the way that you approach the way that you write this proposal, and maybe even all of your proposals, because I think there are lessons to be learned, and there are definitely things to be applied to the proposal writing process that are embedded in lean launchpad methodology that are going to be tremendously helpful to you. So I strongly, strongly, strongly recommend it. Two of the most important things that they emphasize in lean launchpad methodology are in the business model canvas, and those are getting to know your customer and then defining your own value proposition. And if you can do that in the CDMRP proposal, then you're going to be pretty competitive. So in summary, you know, I've focused a lot on the full proposal piece of this, but don't look past the pre-proposal. It has to be solid. 50% of folks will not get an invitation for a full proposal. So you do have to do a good job for that. But as you're doing that, plan ahead for submitting a full proposal. Part of the reason why I say that is the timeline. They're going to review in 1 to 2 months, and then you're going to get as little as maybe 6 weeks to put that proposal, that full proposal together. And the jump there is significant. If you don't have all your ducks in a row by the time you get that invitation letter, then you're going to struggle to do a good job within 6 weeks. You know, there are folks who will prove me wrong on that. They'll put together a proposal in 3 days. And I, you know, I'll admit to you, I've done that too. Not 3 days, but like a short period of time. And I've gotten funded. But that is not what I would advocate. By and large, the majority of the time, it was when I was really well prepared at the pre-proposal stage. I had all my collaborators lined up. We had a solid scope of work that we were going to stick to. We had the budget worked out. A budget can take a lot of time. So especially on a highly collaborative proposal with a lot of different subawards, I made sure I had my budget worked out ahead of time at the pre-proposal stage. But then you've got to do your customer discovery homework. You've got to understand that you've got these folks that are very, very influential in the review process that come at it from maybe a very different perspective than you do as the scientist. So you've got to talk to these people and practice this lean launchpad methodology. There are ways to go through and make those interactions very, very time efficient. So it's not like you're going to spend a ton of time doing this, but you could spend 10 or 15 minutes talking with someone with a different perspective and gain tremendous insight in such a short period of time of how you should be writing your proposal, or at least some things that you should be pointing out and emphasizing to the reviewer. And then engage your tech transfer professionals. I work with TLA a bunch, and as many of you know, I've only been here since August. But I work with TLA a lot. They were one of the first group of folks that I met. They're outstanding. They're incredibly helpful. For the engineering folks, Bob Sleeper is our guy to go to, Doug Hockstead, and their whole staff is just tremendously helpful. And you need their insight if you're being asked to put together a translation plan as part of the particular award mechanism that you are proposing to. And then I would also say, again, because the timeline on this is relatively short, you've got to be organized and you've got to get this thing together quickly, because another thing that I highly, highly recommend is a red team review, especially on the bigger proposals. If you're asking for $1 million to several $1 million, you should have a reviewable draft ready a couple weeks ahead of the deadline, and you should send that out to people to review. I would find internally people, if you can, people at U of A who've gotten CDMRP funding and have reviewed for CDMRP. But if you can't find those people internally, then you need to try to find them externally. And there's ways to do that. And if you need help with that, just contact me, because it's not hard to find people who have both funding and review experience in the CDMRP universe. So I'll stop there, and I'm going to stop my screen share and ask if folks have questions. So just unmute yourself and shout out, and I don't see anything in the chat. You can put something in the chat there too if you want to.
Thank you.
Mark, I have a question. This is Jennifer Barton. So what about resubmissions? You mentioned resubmission. How are those viewed? What do you have to do to convince them that your resubmission is serious?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I've had several of them. I've had folks who have done a good job in taking the review and changing the proposal, and you can see that they're addressing it. And then I've had folks who've ignored it and they get a second bad review. The best thing I can tell you is take the review feedback that you get seriously and work hard to change the proposal. It's not uncommon for review panels to have a very similar makeup from year to year. So these are typically single year cycles, right? The FOIAs pop up in the spring, and the reviews are, the proposal submissions are over the summer. And then in the fall, they'll start the review process. CDMRP in most of the program areas allow folks to be on the panel 3 years in a row. Some don't have limits, but some do. So chances are, if you go in the next year's cycle, you may have some of the same reviewers. If you fail to take the review seriously and implement those changes, there's probably a good chance that there's someone who reviewed your proposal before. And if they see that you haven't made the changes according to the panel's recommendations, then you're just going to get another bad review. So 1, listen to the review, implement those changes. 2, if the review isn't specifically, guiding you to the things that I've just said, do those anyway, because I think those will help make you successful, help you make write a better proposal. But it's a good idea to resubmit, because if you do those things, because again, you may have fallen victim to one of these program level decisions where they liked your proposal, they got a good score, but they had a couple of other programs in that area. Well, maybe those have ended now, and the next year you've got a better chance of funding. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yep. Philip,
who's completely new to this.
I can't hear you.
Oh,
I think it's, I can just barely hear
All
you, so
right.
it's maybe a mic issue. There you go.
Yeah, better now?
Yep, gotcha.
Okay, so for somebody that's completely new to this, how do I pick apart if my research fits anywhere within the scope of what they currently fund? So this seems to be like super disease specific. As a technologist, you know, that could fit in many of those, you know, where, especially as a PI, where do I fit in? How can I assess if I fit in?
Yeah, great question. So, and you pointed out a really important aspect of it. It does get really specific, but the really cool thing about CDMRP is that it's looking for solutions to a multitude of problems within that space. It's not just, hey, let's figure out the molecular biology of this particular disease. It's let's figure out how we make this whole spectrum of things better for people. It could be molecular biology, it could be gene therapy or something like that, but it could also be a technology that addresses a quality of life issue that these patients have. So what I've seen is, even though there's a tendency to look at it and say, oh, this is really disease specific, I don't work in this space. If you really look at what they call for and some of the things that have been funded, I've seen it just open right up, especially with technology application to quality of life issues, for example. So I'll give you a really good example. You know, we had some really cool robotics proposals in the spinal cord injury program last couple cycles, and we just started seeing those. In prior years, it was all about neurobiology, right? It was all about mitigating scar formation and trying to preserve neural function. And so it was all stem cells and molecular biology. Well, just the last couple of years, there have been some mostly mechanical engineering people, ECE, coming in with robotic technology saying, we can improve quality of life. We may not be able to mitigate the injury and give someone back the use of their legs, but we can really improve quality of life with some robotics technologies. So if you really understand the space, if you talk to patients, if you talk to clinicians, I think you'll see, even if you're more of a technically driven person, I think you'll see that there are problems in that space that you can address with the things that you do as an engineer or as a non-cellular molecular biologist. You just need to understand the variety of problems that are out there. And I think personally, it makes you really unique when one of those kinds of proposals lands, like the first robotics proposal that we saw on the spinal cord injury panel. It's like, wow, this is really cool. And nobody's doing this. And the patient advocates love it because they're like, yes, finally, somebody's proposing something that I can understand and that could help my life, rather than the stem cell stuff that seems like it's 20 years down the road. So I would investigate it from that standpoint. And another thing that I would recommend is look at the awards databases and see what else they have funded, because it's important too that you don't overlap, right? You don't want to propose something that somebody else is already doing that was funded in last year's cycle. So you got to do a little bit of intelligence gathering and look at what has previously been funded.
Okay, so probably the best approach is to talk to a clinician and that work with the patient every day and trying to understand the disease and see how you can you know, help in the best way.
Sure, or even these patient advocacy groups. You know, every disease pretty much has a fundraising arm or a patient advocacy arm. They all have websites. You can go to the website. Heck, you can even look at YouTube videos. There are people who will post their day-to-day challenges. Go, you know, like Google type 1 diabetic insulin pump, and you'll see people who are like video blogging about just their day-to-day struggles. You can learn a ton just from YouTube, because patients will put videos up, or you can see blogs, or you can go to these patient advocacy groups, and you'll see discussions about, honestly, the crap that patients have to deal with when there's not a good solution, when there's not a cure for what they have. there's a lot of crap that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. And if you can learn that by YouTube or patient advocacy or finding these blogs, you can learn a ton as a scientist, as an investigator, as a person who develops technology that could potentially help them.
Quick question, Mark. So we have a discovery grant for some of our kidney research, but for a separate project we applied to once. We were actually utilizing patients in the civilian hospital, and so some of the comments came back. I mean, the academic hospital. So comments came back and said, well, you're not using actual military personnel, or you're looking at gunshot wounds in downtown Chicago, not really in a battlefield setting. So can you talk about how do reviewers approach using a civilian comparator to what you would see on the battlefield, or how they address that?
Yeah, and I've seen that. I've reviewed in some of those panels as well. And you're right. There are some injuries that really just have no civilian counterpart, or that the thought is, especially among the military practitioners, the trauma surgeons, that it's very, very different than civilian trauma. So an automobile accident is not the same as someone who gets blown up in a Humvee, or someone who takes a sniper round from 2,000 yards away. It's not the same as a gunshot victim in downtown Chicago. And so they'll criticize for that in some cases. So as the investigator writing the proposal, I think the best thing to do is acknowledge that right up front, and say, rather than either being silent on it, or even, I think even worse, saying that, hey, this is a great surrogate for what you're most interested in. If you say that and you're not right, they're going to clobber you, right? But if you explain it as, we don't have people getting blown up in Humvees in downtown Chicago, so this is what we have to deal with, right? And we understand that it's a surrogate, and we understand that it has its limitations, but you make the argument that if it works for this, it'll work for that. And I think if you're straightforward and honest about that, and that's probably the guidance that you were getting, was you've got to tell me as the reviewer how this is the same, or how it's similar enough that I have confidence that the research that you're doing will be applicable. If you can't make that compelling case, then yeah, I've seen these kinds of proposals get picked apart because of those sorts of surrogate kinds of systems. It's the same sort of thing as dealing with mice and rats and saying, well, this is applicable to humans. That standard statement also doesn't play well, especially with the consumer advocates. Most of the consumer advocates that I've been on panels with, they're like, I'm not a scientist, but I just don't get how mice and rats can be predictive. And you really kind of have to explain it in pretty simple terms about how and why that is.
Excellent.
I've got a quick question. So the program managers, it seems like they have a portfolio in mind of what they want to fill. Do they give feedback in advance, or do you just write a pre-proposal?
Yeah, it's the pre-proposal, unfortunately. There's opportunities, maybe like going to MHRS to talk to some of the program people and get a little bit of insight. They're maybe a little bit more open than the NIH folks. When I see NIH people at meetings, they give you the standard line. There are program people out there who are proposal gatherers, meaning they go around the country, they go to meetings, they say, yeah, submit your proposal, we'll look at it. That's what I call proposal gatherers. And then there are folks who really want to kind of pull proposals in that they really are interested in. DARPA program managers are especially good at this. You'll get standard line from them in public venues, but when you're having a beer at the hotel lobby, then you'll get a little bit more out of them. CDMRP program people are kind of in between NIH, maybe in DARPA. And so you can get a little bit more intel. But if outside of that, the pre-proposal is really your best bet. You'll gauge your interest from that. I'm going to be doing another workshop. It'll be promoted largely to the engineering folks in May. I think May 6th is the date for that. that talks about strategies for broad agency announcements. And that's another way. BAAs are another way to kind of get ideas in front of program people and kind of feel them out. But unfortunately, in this case, your best bet is the pre-proposal. But even then, you still need to do your own intelligence, because at the pre-proposal stage, they're going to be looking at impact, the potential for the impact, and fit to the program. So if it's lupus and lupus is in there and your proposal is about lupus, you fit, right? And you may put together some great science and still not get funded, and get well scored and still not get funded. That's where you need to have done your own homework and looked at what did CDMRP fund over the last 3 years. And if they've already got 3 funded programs in lupus, it's doubtful that you're going to be the 4th one. And so having that intelligence in addition to the feedback that you get from the pre-proposal is kind of where you should center your decision making. And the information about what was funded in prior years is easy to find. You can get that on publicly available databases. What else? I need to check and see. We're coming up on the top of the hour. I think I do have another. No, I'm good. If anybody wants to stay, I'm good till 11:30. So fire away.
Yeah, Marcus, it's only excellent, very informative. Not a question. I know some of our colleagues want to come to this seminar, but the schedule doesn't allow. Do you have this recorded, and then we can pass the information for them to watch? It's very valuable information for many other colleagues.
Yeah, is Amy still on? I don't see her. Or anybody else from Bio 5?
I know it's recorded.
Recording.
There's Amy.
Yeah, we have it recorded, and I can definitely send it out afterward as long as Mark's okay with it.
Yeah, absolutely fine with it. And I was assuming that Bio 5 kind of had a mechanism where they, a place where they archive these things where everybody can go and find it.
We do, yes, and I can put that on. It's our YouTube channel.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll send Amy my slide deck because it's got some hyperlinks in it, Zhongming, that may be a little bit easier for everybody to get to some of the things that I recommended people take a look at. So I'll send her a PDF of my slide deck with the hyperlinks in it too.
That's great. Thank you, Mark.
Yep, no problem. Anything else?
Well, thank you very much. That's great.
You're welcome. No other questions. I'll let everybody get back to their day. Hopefully it was informative. If you have any other questions, just feel free to email me.
Yes, thanks.
All right, take care. Thanks, Amy. Appreciate you setting all this up.
Sure, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.